Over the last several years, a quiet revolution has been unfolding across the global manufacturing landscape. Factory floors that once hummed with activity in China have been steadily relocated to emerging markets across Southeast Asia. Vietnam, Thailand, and especially India have positioned themselves as the new frontiers of industrial production. The promise seemed, well, irresistible. Lower wages, vast workforces, and governments eager to roll out the red carpet for foreign investment. Foxconn, the Taiwanese manufacturing behemoth that assembles the majority of the world's iPhones, became one of the most prominent companies to embrace this shift. With operations spanning continents and employing over 1 million workers at its peak, Foxconn's strategic decisions send ripples throughout the entire global economy. When the company announced major investments in India, it appeared to validate the narrative that manufacturing's future lay beyond China's borders. But something unexpected happened. In July 2024, Foxconn made a stunning announcement that caught industry observers off guard. The company would invest 1 billion yuan to construct a brand new headquarters facility in China. This wasn't a token gesture or symbolic investment. It represented a fundamental strategic pivot back toward the very market many analysts had written off as too expensive, too competitive, and too yesterday. Even more telling, Apple itself, Foxconn's largest client and one of the world's most valuable corporations, has quietly begun reversing course. Production lines that were ceremoniously transferred to Indian facilities just years earlier are now being relocated back to Chinese factories. This isn't just about one company or one decision. It represents a dramatic reality check for India's ambitious Make in India initiative, a campaign that promised to transform the South Asian nation into the world's next manufacturing superpower. What went so catastrophically wrong? Why are global manufacturers abandoning a market of 1.4 billion people with seemingly limitless potential? And what does this tell us about the true requirements for becoming a manufacturing hub in the 21st century? Before we dive deeper into this story, if you appreciate in-depth analysis of global economic trends, please subscribe to this channel and enable notifications. We bring you the stories behind the headlines that shape our interconnected world. Now, let's unpack this manufacturing mystery. To understand why companies are returning to China, we first need to examine what made the country so attractive in the first place, and why those advantages prove so difficult to replicate elsewhere. China, with its population of 1.4 billion people, has long been viewed as an essential market by multinational corporations across every industry. The numbers tell a compelling story. According to comprehensive research data, more than 40% of all multinational enterprises maintain significant investment operations within Chinese territory. This isn't coincidental. It reflects decades of carefully constructed advantages. In 2023, the China Council for the Promotion of International Trade conducted an extensive survey covering more than 400 foreign-invested companies operating within the country. The findings revealed fascinating patterns about who invests in China and why. Approximately 43% of these enterprises originated from developed Western economies, primarily the United States and European Union nations. Interestingly, 71% were classified as small and micro-sized businesses, while 45% came from traditional manufacturing sectors. Perhaps most striking were the growth figures in specific industries. Smart consumer devices and professional technical services experienced explosive foreign investment growth of 332.9% and 103.1% respectively in a single year. These aren't marginal improvements. They represent massive confidence in China's ability to support high-value, technology-intensive manufacturing. Apple's journey in China perfectly illustrates this dynamic. The Cupertino-based technology giant has invested billions of dollars establishing manufacturing operations throughout China. But Apple didn't just build factories. It cultivated an entire ecosystem of suppliers, component manufacturers, and logistics partners. This strategic approach allowed Apple to optimize its supply chain in ways that would have been impossible if the company had relied solely on importing components from distant locations. Enter Foxconn, formerly known as Honhai Precision Industry. Founded in Taiwan during the 1970s and 1980s, Foxconn evolved from a modest connector manufacturer into one of the largest electronics contractors on the planet. The company's rise paralleled the growth of the global electronics industry, and its business model, providing high-volume manufacturing services for major brands, proved spectacularly successful. By the early 2000s, Foxconn had become Apple's most critical manufacturing partner. The relationship deepened significantly in 2010, when, with Apple's substantial backing, Foxconn established a massive production campus in Henan Province, specifically in the city of Zhengzhou. The transformation that followed was nothing short of remarkable. Before Foxconn arrived, Zhengzhou's total export trade volume stood at a modest $3.456 billion annually. The city was hardly a major player in global trade. But within just one decade, that figure exploded to $20.2 billion, an almost six-fold increase. Foxconn's Zhengzhou facility became known as iPhone City, a sprawling complex that at its peak employed hundreds of thousands of workers and could produce an estimated 500,000 iPhones daily during peak production periods. This wasn't merely about cheap labor. Foxconn's success in China stemmed from a unique combination of factors that proved extraordinarily difficult to replicate. The company benefited from China's comprehensive industrial base, where virtually any component or specialized tool could be sourced domestically. If a production line needed a custom part, local suppliers could often fabricate it within hours rather than days or weeks. China's infrastructure also played a crucial role. High-speed rail networks connected major cities. Modern ports could handle massive container volumes with remarkable efficiency. Reliable electrical grids ensured factories could operate around the clock without interruption. Telecommunications networks supported sophisticated just-in-time manufacturing systems. Perhaps most importantly, China had developed an enormous talent pool of engineers, technicians, and skilled workers familiar with advanced manufacturing processes. These weren't merely assembly line workers following simple instructions. Modern electronics manufacturing requires sophisticated understanding of quality control, process optimization, and rapid problem-solving when issues arise. But success breeds challenges. As more foreign companies flooded into China, competition intensified. The market that once seemed limitless began showing signs of saturation in certain sectors. More significantly, the very economic development that made China attractive started changing the cost equation. Chinese workers, quite naturally, expected rising wages as their economy grew and their productivity increased. Labor costs that had once been remarkably low by global standards began climbing steadily. Land prices in major industrial zones soared as demand outpaced supply. Tax incentives that local governments had offered to attract initial investment gradually expired or were scaled back. The China price, that seemingly unbeatable combination of low costs and high quality, was becoming more expensive. For multinational corporations accustomed to razor-thin margins, these rising costs demanded attention. Financial officers began running calculations comparing China's established advantages against emerging alternatives. And increasingly, those alternatives were located in Southeast Asia. Vietnam emerged as an early alternative, particularly for apparel and lower complexity electronics. But India captured the imagination of global strategists in a way that smaller nations simply couldn't match. With a population exceeding 1.4 billion people, potentially surpassing China as the world's most populous nation, India offered theoretical scale that matched China's demographic profile. International financial institutions enthusiastically promoted India's potential. J.P. Morgan Chase and other major investment banks published research reports highlighting India's young, growing workforce. Economists projected that if India could effectively mobilize its human capital, the country could generate millions of new jobs annually, absorbing workers transitioning from agriculture into manufacturing employment. The wage differential seemed compelling. Indian manufacturing workers earned significantly less than their Chinese counterparts. Land costs were lower. Local governments, desperate for investment and employment, offered generous tax breaks and regulatory concessions. Prime Minister Narendra Modi's administration launched the Make in India campaign in 2014 with enormous fanfare. The initiative aimed to transform India into a manufacturing powerhouse, explicitly positioning the country as an alternative to China. Modi's government set ambitious targets: increase manufacturing's share of GDP to 25%, create 100 million new jobs, and establish India as a hub for both domestic consumption and global exports. The strategy borrowed conceptually from China's economic opening decades earlier: use market access as leverage to attract foreign investment, technology transfer, and expertise. India would offer multinational corporations access to its massive consumer market in exchange for establishing local manufacturing operations. By 2022, the strategy appeared to be gaining traction. India attracted $11.3 billion in foreign investment into its manufacturing sector that year. With explicit support from the United States government, which was actively encouraging companies to diversify supply chains away from China due to geopolitical concerns, Western corporations accelerated their Indian investments. Foreign investment inflows reached 12% of certain key sectors. Foxconn, ever attentive to where its major clients were moving, followed Apple's lead in expanding Indian operations. The company announced significant investments in manufacturing facilities across multiple Indian states. Media coverage portrayed this as a historic shift, with headlines proclaiming India's arrival as a credible manufacturing alternative. For a brief moment, the narrative seemed validated. The Make in India dream appeared to be materializing. Act 3, when reality bites. But behind the optimistic press releases and ribbon-cutting ceremonies, foreign manufacturers were encountering a harsh reality that would ultimately doom India's manufacturing ambitions, at least in the short term. The problems began almost immediately after companies started actual production rather than merely making investment announcements. One of the most troubling issues involved the Indian government's own behavior toward foreign investors. Once multinational corporations had established operations and begun generating revenue, they increasingly found themselves targeted by Indian regulatory authorities. Companies received massive fines and penalties, often on technical grounds related to alleged patent fee omissions, tariff evasion, or transfer pricing irregularities. By 2023, nearly 2,800 multinational companies had faced regulatory restrictions or financial penalties from Indian government agencies. Even Apple, despite being actively courted by the Modi government, wasn't immune. The company faced investigations and challenges that created uncertainty about the business environment. This created a troubling pattern. India appeared eager to attract foreign investment, but then seemed to treat successful foreign companies as sources of government revenue through fines rather than as partners to be nurtured. Beyond regulatory challenges, fundamental infrastructure problems plagued manufacturing operations. India's electronics manufacturing base remained underdeveloped despite years of government initiatives. The country lacked the comprehensive network of component suppliers that made China so effective. Critical parts still needed to be imported, creating supply chain bottlenecks and reducing the cost advantages of manufacturing locally. The talent gap proved even more problematic. While India produces millions of engineering graduates annually, the specific skills required for high-volume electronics manufacturing proved scarce. Unlike China, where decades of manufacturing experience had created deep institutional knowledge and training systems, India was essentially starting from scratch. Companies had to invest heavily in training programs, and even then, achieving consistent quality remained elusive. Then came geopolitical complications that made the situation worse. Relations between India and China deteriorated due to border disputes and broader strategic competition. The COVID-19 pandemic provided additional justification for the Indian government to tighten visa policies for Chinese nationals. This created a bizarre paradox. Companies had relocated to India partly to diversify away from China, but they still desperately needed Chinese technical expertise and components. Foxconn found that critical technicians couldn't get visas to travel to Indian facilities when production problems arose. Essential components faced customs delays. The very de-Sinicization policy that was supposed to make India attractive was undermining manufacturers' ability to operate effectively. But perhaps the most devastating problems were the most basic ones. Issues so fundamental they're easy to overlook when making investment decisions based on spreadsheets and projections. Cultural factors significantly impacted workplace dynamics. Indian labor practices, workplace expectations, and management styles differed substantially from what Foxconn's systems were designed around. The company struggled to implement the intensive work schedules and quality control processes that had proven effective in China. Infrastructure failures created constant disruptions. In one particularly telling example, power supply became a critical bottleneck. During India's intense summer heat, when electricity demand peaks, government authorities mandated that factories reduce power consumption by 30% to prevent grid failures. For a modern electronics manufacturing facility where precision equipment must operate continuously under controlled conditions, such power restrictions are catastrophic. The quality problems resulting from these challenges were staggering. Industry sources reported that Foxconn's Indian facilities achieved yield rates, meaning the percentage of products that pass quality inspection, of approximately 50%. Think about what that means. For every 2 products assembled, only 1 met quality standards. The other had to be disassembled, repaired, or scrapped entirely. In electronics manufacturing, yields of 95% or higher are typical in mature facilities. Anything below 90% is considered problematic. A 50% yield rate represents a complete operational failure. It means you're essentially making each product twice, doubling labor costs, component waste, and time requirements, while still missing delivery commitments. For a company like Apple, which prides itself on product quality and carefully manages its brand reputation, such failure rates were simply unacceptable. Customers purchasing premium devices expect perfection, not products with a 50-50 chance of having defects. Act 4. The return. Faced with these compounding challenges, Foxconn reached a breaking point. The company's leadership recognized that the Indian experiment, despite enormous investment and effort, simply wasn't working. The cost savings from lower wages were being completely erased by quality problems, training expenses, infrastructure challenges, and operational inefficiencies. In July 2024, Foxconn made its dramatic announcement, a 1 billion yuan investment to construct new headquarters facilities in Henan Province, China. This wasn't a minor expansion or token project. The investment encompasses 7 major strategic initiatives, including headquarters management, research and development, strategic industrial development, and comprehensive supply chain management. The announcement built on earlier moves. In April 2024, Foxconn had already begun establishing its new China headquarters, but the July announcement represented a significant acceleration and expansion of these plans. Company statements describe this as part of their New Era development plan, suggesting a fundamental strategic reorientation rather than a tactical adjustment. Particularly revealing were Foxconn's plans for electric vehicle development. The company announced multiple EV-related projects to be based in China, covering everything from vehicle design and production to battery technology investments. Electric vehicles represent one of the most significant growth opportunities in manufacturing, with global sales projected to continue rapid expansion throughout the decade. Foxconn's decision to center its EV ambitions in China, rather than India or Southeast Asia, speaks volumes about where the company believes advanced manufacturing is most viable. EV production is even more complex than smartphone assembly, requiring sophisticated battery systems, power electronics, and software integration. It's exactly the type of high-value manufacturing that countries like India hope to attract. Apple's parallel decisions reinforce this trend. Throughout 2024, the company quietly began relocating production capacity that had been moved to India back to Chinese facilities. Apple hasn't issued press releases about this reversal. Companies rarely advertise their strategic mistakes. But industry observers and supply chain analysts documented the shift through factory orders and shipment data. The implications extend far beyond Foxconn and Apple. When the world's largest electronics contractor and the world's most valuable consumer technology company both reverse course on India simultaneously, it sends an unmistakable signal to the entire manufacturing industry. If these industry giants with essentially unlimited resources couldn't make Indian manufacturing work, what chance do smaller companies have? Act 5. India's Reckoning. The Modi government has responded to these setbacks with renewed pledges and initiatives. Authorities announced plans to invest $24 billion over 5 years to promote employment and improve manufacturing infrastructure. But many industry experts believe these measures represent too little, too late. The Make in India campaign's actual results have fallen dramatically short of its ambitious targets. Rather than attracting sustained foreign investment, India is increasingly seeing companies exit the market. Each departure triggers ripple effects throughout the economy. When Foxconn scales back operations, it's not just about direct employment at Foxconn facilities. Entire ecosystems of suppliers, logistics providers, and service companies that had built their businesses around Foxconn contracts suddenly face existential threats. This multiplier effect means job losses extend far beyond the manufacturing plants themselves. For India, this represents a crushing disappointment. The country desperately needs manufacturing jobs to absorb workers transitioning from rural agriculture into urban employment. Creating sufficient formal employment for India's young, growing population represents one of the most significant economic and social challenges facing the nation. Manufacturing seemed like the obvious answer. It had worked spectacularly well for China, South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan in previous generations. But India is discovering that manufacturing success requires more than just low wages and a large population. It demands comprehensive infrastructure, consistent governance, stable business environments, skilled workforces, and sophisticated supply chain networks. Building these capabilities takes decades, not years. China didn't become the world's factory overnight. It required 40 years of sustained development, massive infrastructure investment, institutional learning, and gradual capability building. India attempted to shortcut this process, and the results have been humbling. Foxconn's return to China highlights advantages that don't appear on simple cost comparison spreadsheets. China has developed something extraordinarily rare, a comprehensive industrial ecosystem that supports manufacturing at every level. Consider industrial classification systems. The United Nations maintains a detailed taxonomy of every type of industrial activity, from basic materials processing to advanced technology manufacturing. China is the only country in the world that possesses competitive capabilities across every single category. This means that regardless of what you're manufacturing, all necessary inputs, components, and services are available domestically. Need specialized chemicals? Available locally. Precision tooling? Multiple domestic suppliers. Custom packaging? Can be delivered same day in major industrial zones. This density of capabilities creates enormous efficiency advantages that are invisible until you try to operate somewhere they don't exist. China's logistics infrastructure represents another massive advantage. The country has built the world's most extensive high-speed rail network, connecting major cities with trains running at over 300 kilometers per hour. Modern ports handle container volumes that dwarf facilities in most other nations. Highway networks reach even secondary cities. This means moving goods domestically is fast, cheap, and reliable. The workforce advantages extend beyond just numbers. China has developed vocational training systems that produce millions of skilled manufacturing workers annually. Universities graduate enormous numbers of engineers, many with practical experience through internship programs integrated with manufacturing companies. This creates a talent pool that understands manufacturing not just theoretically, but practically. Government effectiveness matters more than many Western analysts appreciate. Chinese local governments have become sophisticated at supporting manufacturing development. They understand supply chain requirements, can quickly approve permits and address regulatory issues, and actively work to solve companies' problems. This doesn't mean China lacks bureaucracy. It certainly exists. But government officials often view manufacturing success as directly tied to their own career advancement, creating strong incentives for effective support. Social stability, while politically complex, provides business predictability. Companies can make long-term investment decisions with reasonable confidence that dramatic changes won't occur overnight. Labor relations, while evolving as wages rise, remain generally stable without the frequent strikes or disruptions that plague manufacturing in some other countries. China's market size creates its own advantages.